It's going to have 8 CPU cores. It's a monster.
Doesn't seem that long ago we were discussing the previous monster. Now there's more on the horizon. Brand new hardware and new generation is palpably close, and that means we can look ahead and analyse what to expect. There's many areas of differences between these two consoles, and that's what's very exciting. So for me, I'm actually looking forward to diving into this much more than the last generation, because I feel there's going to be a significant gap at times between the two pieces of hardware, and that can form on both sides of the fence, and that's the most exciting thing. So to keep it on point and focused, I'm breaking these down into multiple videos discussing one subject at a time. So this one is all about those brand spanking new CPUs. But before all that, in a surreal event of being locked indoors, a perfect antithesis to the boredom that can set in is Raid Shadow Legends. It's a hark back to the old Dungeons and Dragons of days gone by, but this time rather than whacking out a board and playing for hours, you can simply whack out your phone or PC and play on the go, on the toilet, or wherever you may be. But just make sure you're in a safe place to do so. The title offers hundreds of characters to choose from, a plethora of environments and dungeons to battle in, or even a good old-fashioned tavern to pop in, grab a drink and sacrifice your hordes to improve your power. With multiple ways to play, with clan bosses, boss battles, campaign and even player versus player, cross-play on PC and handhelds, you can earn XP, boost your characters and enjoy the story as it unfolds before you. This free-to-play bonanza is available right now in the link description below, and if you're a brand new player, you can click that link and get additional benefits such as 100,000 silver, 1 energy refill, XP boost and much more. So click the link below, download now and make your legend a reality. So, a brand new generation of hardware always has to offer lots of new options and capabilities over and above just faster clock rates and throughput. But the Zen CPUs that are now replacing the outgoing Jaguar on all machines, including the Pro and the standard models, is a big leap forward. Specifically around the fact that they're going to be running around 3.5 and 3.6 gigahertz between them. That is a substantial improvement, not only in just frequency, but obviously IPC count from the Zen improvement that they offer. These are both Zen 2 CPUs. Now the Series X has an additional caveat there. Microsoft have quite intelligently put in an additional option there where you can disable SMT and actually boost the clocks up to 3.8 gigahertz. I talked about this before in my original video, I can't remember which one, but I was specifically talking about the fact that if you lower the baseline, everyone else comes with it. It's arguably the same comment that Mark Cerny was mentioning about a rising tide raises all boats. That essentially is the same thing. If you improve the single core speed, it means that developers don't have to write asynchronous CPU code, essentially, multi-thread your work, your jobs, to manage the workload more efficiently and break it up into chunks to work across multiple threads. If you improve the performance on one thread, or 8 threads, or 7 in this case, was what a lot of developers are used to on their current gen consoles, then that means you just improve it slightly, a little bit over what the standard hardware can deliver, and that's exactly why that mode is there. Whether it will make a huge difference, I'm going to dive into that now. So before we jump into that, let's talk about the last generation consoles and the hardware comparison. So remember, one of the things that the Xbox One did at the launch was it boosted its clocks, ever so small, very slight boost, but it boosted both the GPU and the CPU. Now in the CPU's section, it boosted it from 1.6 gigahertz, which was allegedly going to be the same speed as the PS4, to 1.75 gigahertz, which the PS4 is 1.6. So those two models do have a gap between their frequency speeds, and that makes a difference in performance. So it's a very minor gap, let's be clear. It's only around 9.3% between the two pieces of hardware, but it does mean that you should see somewhere around 9 to 10% improvement in CPU bound scenarios. But obviously in my years of analysing the hardware, that never happened. Now, why was that, and what examples can we give? Well, jumping right back to my Just Cause 3, which is probably one of the bigger CPU pounders back in the day, the early section, which is on rails, which limits the action and really drives the pyrotechnics and explosions and destructions of that game really push forward. It drives the CPU. Now, bearing in mind the PS4 is running a high resolution, but we're not talking about GPU here. We're just concentrating on CPU in this whole video. So please don't bring up GPU conversations. So here, I'm talking about CPU. And looking at the original analysis that I did in this opening section, we can see the PS4 is a high of 30, the same as the Xbox One, because it's capped at that. But they both both hit a low of 19 FPS, and the average between them comes out around 4%, 26.31 versus 27.33. So that 9.3% increase in performance on the CPU has made a potential very small difference to the average, but absolutely no difference at all to the lows, and that's what you would expect with a CPU improvement. Obviously, if you are CPU bound. Now that's an odd situation, isn't it? Because surely if you improve clock rates, you improve performance, specifically when they're the same architecture and hardware, which these two consoles are. And if you look at the Pro gives us an example of what happens when you boost it on exactly the same architecture, stroke, software development and API. I stress this all the time. People always forget about the APIs and the drivers. They are a huge part of a console and hardware pieces of performance. Now, if you boost it up to what the Pro delivers in boost mode, which is 2.1 gigahertz over the 1.6 gigahertz, everything else being equal, it's pretty much the identical CPU, then that's a 31.2% improvement. And that means we get the same peak of 30 FPS because it won't break that ceiling, but it means the average and more specifically the lows see the biggest improvement so far, going from 19 FPS to 23 is a low in the exact same section. That's a 21% improvement, and the average is 11.4% better. But that shows you there that a 31.2% improvement on CPU clocks only gives you at best a 21% improvement. Diminishing returns or something else? Well, arguably, I don't really know exactly because I'm not a developer with access to the code at this particular point, so I can't see anything that's going on in the engine. But I would guess that there's more things going on in the engine than just the CPU. That's not really being clever, I'm being sarcastic there. That's how the world works. So at the best case scenario, in very similar situations, you see around 80% of an improvement from an upclock on CPU in this particularly CPU bound scenario. And it's not the only one that we can look at. We can also look at AC Unity, another very highly bound CPU title. Now, way back when I covered the Pro Boost modes, the AC Unity, when it originally launched on the PS4 and the Xbox One, was unlocked. So it had an unlocked frame rate. So I was able to test both the PS4 and the Pro in identical situations. You can check out the video, the link's below as well, but here's a quick glimpse of the videos. And we can see that we get a high of 42 on the PS4 and a high of 52 on the Pro. All resolution is the same, it's still 900p. Now, the average on the medium is 34.4 versus 42.4, and the lows drop down to 28 on the PS4 and 35 on the Pro. The low is probably the best place to catch out where we're looking in terms of CPU bottlenecks, because the GPU is significantly better on the Pro, and that's not really a fair comparison. This game was largely CPU bound all the time. So that 31% improvement is giving us 25% at best in these identical sections. On average, it comes closer to 27.3% between the two, but in this particular section, it's 25%. So again, we're getting around 80-85% of that performance improvement across the two machines. And that's identical hardware, identical architecture on the identical SDK, and more importantly, the API connectors, the software that they use, the developers use to write to the hardware and deliver the performance benefits. And as I mentioned on all my other videos, including my teraflop one, the API is just another factor you have to take into account. Now, the hardware splits between the two systems are there. There's definitely a big difference, which I've covered in detail, between the PS4 and the Xbox One. But it's not just that. And that's why you are not seeing a substantial improvement on CPU performance over what the PS4 is, even though the PS4 has a slower CPU. That doesn't mean that's what's going to happen in the future console generation. Before anyone jumps on me and says that, I'm giving you examples. I don't know. I don't have access to the hardware. I'm giving you hypotheticals in reality based on my knowledge and experience. It's obvious. And this was actually touched on many, many times by many, many developers. In fact, there's a great interview with Digital Foundry and the 4A developer, Olos Shishkostov, who talked about the difference between the two APIs in the PS4 and the Xbox One, specifically DirectX 11 at the time, and then the PS4 version, which is GNMX, and then GNM. Now, GNM is a lower version. GNMX is a wrapper that basically allows you to develop, or at least minimize the amount of effort for porting a DirectX version over to PS4. But the issue that he talked about was the fact that the driver on the Xbox One, the mono driver, was actually swamping one single core of the Xbox One, just issuing draw calls, and therefore was minimizing the profiling tool, even with that 1.75 gigahertz overclock. Now PS4, you could barely see it on the profiler. It was barely touching one of the cores or threads in terms of its workload, so it had a lot more capacity to do even more work. And that wasn't about the hardware. The hardware's identical. That was all about the APIs. And those differences between the APIs, DirectX 11, DirectX 12, DirectX 12 Ultimate now, and obviously Sony's version, GNMX, GNM, obviously Vulkan is another example on PC. All of those make a big difference. And I really expect both teams to be much closer this time because, let's be honest, Microsoft came out of the gate last time in a very bad position, both from a hardware stance and a software stance. They've really pushed forward this time, and they're pushing DirectX 12 Ultimate to really drive home that SDK and that development environment that these consoles will run on. And one of the big benefits they're pushing for is they're trying to develop one single API that will run the same game across multiple pieces of hardware. Remember, consoles now, the Xbox consoles, run Windows operating systems. So this is something you need to bear in mind. And Sony have got the same challenges with their backwards compatibility of PS4, so they have to make sure the titles run across new hardware and legacy hardware, and that's the benefits at the moment. Whether or not they're going to run new games for very long on the PS4, I don't think they will, but that's a discussion for another day. So moving to modern titles and moving to our latest one here, let's look at the SMT on and SMT off before we look at that difference of 100 megahertz between the two consoles. SMT is simultaneous multi-threading, which is Intel's version is hyper-threading. So it's using multiple threads within the same individual cores. It basically balances the jobs back and forth. You've got to understand the CCX calculations there in terms of cache and moving data around the two islands of the Infinity Fabric. So there is a level of cache impact here when you use hyperthreading. One thread stops, one thread starts, but I won't go into that for this video. But essentially you lose a little bit of coherency when you're using that hyperthreading ability, because you're essentially popping things on and off the stack, pausing threads, coming out of sleep. There's lots of consistency there, the kernels and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, I'm going to digress into the woods. So taking all that account, what we can see is a performance improvement of around 0.4% on the highs. It's margin of error territory. In fact, 3%, 2%, it's all margin of error territory. It's very, very minor. There is a very small improvement to performance on what is a largely GPU-bound title, even here on the 2700 at 1080p Ultra. But you see the no SMT options going right down to 3.3 gigahertz. You can see around 10 to 15% at its best point in terms of improvement. But the only time it's getting anywhere near the 15% reduction in clock rates is the median. And again, that can be all margin of error stuff when you're moving around. The highs and lows are within 10%. So a 15% improvement on clock rates only gets you around 10% improvement on CPU. And this is on identical pieces of hardware, identical operating systems, identical titles. There's no closer example that I can give than this particular one right here. But you are seeing about 7 or 8% reduction over the clock rates on the SMT on, SMT off, but you're getting marginally 2% difference. It's minor. Another title that is CPU bound, very much on the consoles and on PC, is The Witcher 3. And this title and titles like it are ones where you might see a bigger benefit because they have one worker thread that's starting to push the work through. So by improving that to 3.8 gigahertz, turning that SMT off, we can see a best case scenario of around 6% on highs, 2% on lows, and around 7.3% on the median. That's not a huge return on around 7 or 8%, although the median again comes out pretty much around that level you'd want. So that's probably the best level you're going to expect. 129 FPS versus 127 as a high, but the biggest improvement from this is at lows, 76 or 78 on the best case scenario versus 72. And that's because by using those cores, it means you're dedicating more work at a slightly higher clock, and you're not having to worry about swapping data back and forth, which can cause you little micro bubbles, micro stutters on the CPU performance. And this is why you're seeing that subtle boost, and that's what that SMT will do when you turn it off and improve the frequency. You're just helping some of these older titles. But in reality, you're probably going to see around 3 to 4% on the lows at best case scenario. Some of the 120 Hz titles may help and may push a little bit beyond that, but they're going to be minor, and it's all going to be about just reducing those little micro stutters on the lows. It's very minor. Probably the best case scenario is AC Unity, which comes in with around 4 to 9% difference between having a 3.8 gigahertz SMT off and a 3.9 gigahertz SMT on which obviously goes in the favour of the SMT on, and that's an older title. So you're not seeing a huge gap there, even if you're going 100 megahertz higher. So you can push it either or, but really the difference there is very, very small. And that means that the difference between 3.5 gigahertz and 3.6 gigahertz on identical CPUs is all going to come down to those APIs that I've already covered. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a great example of a title that is heavily CPU bound, and by running the benchmark it's repeatable and static, which means it gives us the most ideal scenario between the two. So running a 3.5 GHz SMT on version gives us 214 as a high and 89 as a low, versus 246 as a high and 83 as a low with SMT off. You're probably scratching your head at this point. But what you can also see is if you turn SMT off and run at the same clock rate, you actually get slightly better highs, but you get worse lows. Ironically, because this title uses DirectX 12 and is very well multi-threaded, which means it's utilizing those threads much better than the average title will. So in this particular instance, it's much better to run it with it on than off. And that's borne out by the fact that a 3.8 GHz SMT on is almost 16 or 25% higher at its best point between 3.8 gigs with SMT off. So it's pretty clear that higher clocks and SMT make the biggest improvement to this title. You pick your poison. Do you want sheer throughput for maybe 3%, or do you want slightly better highs for maybe 12% at best case scenario? And again, this is all going to be within margin of error, and your mileage may vary depending on the title of the game and just what you're looking at in terms of the gameplay itself. So just bear that in mind when you're thinking about the next generation consoles. That 100 megahertz is smaller than the gap we saw last generation, nearly 50% smaller. But really, the gap isn't about the hardware, as I've already demonstrated from the previous generation. It's actually more about the software, how the teams use it, and certainly how those APIs manage that hardware to give the best quality and performance of that abstraction layer to developers, or more specifically the engine developers, so that they can maximize and leverage all of that hardware as best they can. DirectX 12, Vulkan, and all those pushes in this generation have all been about minimizing CPU bottlenecks, and largely that's driven by the Jaguars being as weak relatively as they are. They're not terrible CPUs, as games have already proven, but the more you can squeeze out of hardware, the better. And with this generation being at the heart of it, a 3.5 or 3.6 GHz Zen 2 8th core 16 thread CPUs means that it's a seismic improvement in all areas, from performance, content, destructibility, interaction, and scope for developers. Alongside the fact that with, as I've proven time and time again, single dedicated boxes, single dedicated hardware, focusing on one particular piece of hardware and lower level API and control just empowers people to get even more out of that hardware. And this kind of CPU on a PC is a seismic improvement, but on console, it'll be even bigger. Now, this improvement in CPU is largely the reason why 120 FPS titles will be a reality on both consoles. Wolfenstein, Doom, Resident Evil 2 and many, many more will have 1080p 120Hz modes, even 1440p. It is a reality. But for me, the virtual reality options 120Hz native on PSVR with all the additional benefits of the visual quality, the resolution and the interaction means I cannot wait to dive into just what the teams will deliver, and it will really push the medium forward. Whether even you play it on consoles or PC, VR will improve once this becomes the new baseline. Anyway, I hope this video helped you understand what you can expect of these CPUs, how the SMT on and SMT off actually affects performance, and it gives you an idea of just what we can look forward to once those games and machines ship. And I can start digging into them in more detail. I will be back very soon with my next episode in this series of looking at the individual parts of the hardware and just how they play out. But please give me feedback below. Do you like this? Do you want more detail? Do you want less detail? Do you want me to focus on certain areas? I need your feedback. That always helps me deliver better quality. But for now, I'm out, and I'll catch you on the next one.